Oh, yeah, they all accept invincible ignorance, okay? Ludwig, all these people accept the implicit heretical understanding of baptism of desire. Not implicit desire for baptism, but implicit faith. Okay, that people who don't even know of Christ can be saved.
Oh, yeah, that's possible.
Well, that's the fact. And so that proves, my point is, again, it proves nothing. They were just heretical catechisms. And the point is that this was the groundwork for the great apostasy. Once this started to build and be perpetuated, and it became commonplace that you can be saved without baptism, and that's why there was that interesting book that was quoted near the end of my book, where you had this Novus Ordo, quote, Jesuit who was commenting on the whole history of this issue. And he was pointing out he's not a traditionalist in any way, shape, or form. And he admitted that in the 40s and 30s, basically, people stopped believing in the traditional understanding of the dogma. That's what he said. Okay, so one of the big problems today is that a lot of the defenders of baptism of desire have the impression that everyone before Vatican II was like staunch, that there wasn't a problem, and so they basically go back to whatever was being taught in catechisms and by theologians at that time, and they say, well, this is safe. No, sorry. And so you're getting, especially on the salvation issue, heresy. And so
I guess in my thinking of this when I've done my study on this, I figured that baptism of desire was mutually exclusive between, the salvation outside the church. There's no salvation. I didn't think that they had much to do with each other, to be honest with you.
Well, how could you say that if you're familiar with our material when we prove?
Because I figured that anyone outside the church is not saved, and I realized that. I was just, from what I've read and everything I've studied, to me the position would be plausible that Christ in His mercy, if you had a catechumen of goodwill, just because, so many theologians and so many people taught that, I figured that it's got to be due to the common consent of the, theologians, a lot of the saints, that, it's plausible. So I put some weight behind it, I guess.
Well, also, let me clarify for those who might not be familiar with what we're talking about, that the saints who believed in baptism of desire never extended it to people of other religions.
Right.
They only extended it to people who believed in Jesus Christ and the Trinity, and who wanted to be baptized. Right. They did not extend it to pagans, Jews. Okay, so they were simply wrong on that issue, but they did not teach the outright heresy of salvation in invincible ignorance, etc. Right. However, everyone who today defends baptism of desire pretty much either believes in salvation for members of false religions, every traditional priest who defends baptism of desire, or accepts the heresy. As I've proven, you accept that heresy because you regard as Catholics groups and individuals who believe that. So you might not personally claim to believe that, but you have to admit that people can be Catholic who believe that. So you wind up accepting that heresy. Here's another question for you.
Go ahead.
Pope Boniface VIII defined that it's absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff.
Right.
Do you believe that?
I do.
So this person who can be saved without baptism, is he subject to the Roman Pontiff?
He subjects himself to the Roman Pontiff, being a catechumen.
So he is, according to you?
According, to the letter, by the book, from what the Church, infallibly teaches, I guess, unless there's some theological principle, which I thought I was missing, which does sort of connect him there, and I'm not trying to double talk here, but from what I know, no, the only way you're submissive or in submission to the Roman Pontiff is by baptism, correct?
Well, that's the point, that the Council of Trent says that the Church, this is infallible, the Church exercises judgment or jurisdiction on no one who has not previously entered it by the gate of baptism. And it's talking about the sacrament.
Where does that say that in the Council of Trent? That's an exact quote right there?
Yeah, Session 14, Chapter 2, on the sacraments of baptism and penance. So it says, since the Church exercises judgment on no one who has not previously entered it by the gate of baptism. And it's talking about the sacrament, because the decree is on the sacraments of baptism. So it's saying that the Church cannot exercise any jurisdiction over an unsacramentally baptized person.
Why does it say that in the Council of Trent at the same time that without the desire for them? Like in Session 7 and even in Session 6, Chapter 4. Why do they even have or desire without at least a desire for them?
Okay.
Faith alone men can obtain that from God the grace of justification, let him be anathema. Session 7 is more, I guess, sways me more than Session 6, Chapter 4. I've listened to your interpretation of it. It makes sense that way, and then when you hear other people's interpretation of it, it seems, that way as well for me. And then I look at what is manifest. If your interpretation of Session 6, Chapter 4 is true, then it seems to me like more people would have understood this, and it would be in, catechisms are taught in books, or do you believe that the councils or the Catechism of Trent teaches baptism and desire, or is that a misread as well?
No, it does. It definitely does, but it's not infallible.
I know it's not infallible, and you try to have common sense and go about this with an approach that way. Why would it be in there then? Why would Barrow Mayo have it in there?
It's in there because people made mistakes and were following common opinions of theologians at the time rather than rooting themselves strictly in the dogmatic definitions. Okay, and actually the very sentence in which it appears in the Catechism of Trent, which is not infallible, is proven to be erroneous because, and this is another point, okay, that it says that for a person for whom baptism is impossible to receive, God can dispose him to receive grace and righteousness. Okay, it says impossible.
Right.
Do you believe baptism can be impossible for some to receive?
I don't know what circumstances they're determining that in.
All right, well, I'll answer that.
By themselves and can't get baptized, yes. I believe you can't baptize yourself. Do I believe it in most cases? No, I don't believe it's impossible.
But you believe it could be impossible in certain cases?
I guess, yeah.
Well, that's what the Catechism of Trent says. Well, here's what the Council of Trent says. Right. Section 6, Chapter 11, Denzinger 804. No one should make use of that rash statement forbidden under an anathema by the Fathers, that the commandments of God are impossible to observe for a man who is justified, for God does not command impossibilities. And the Catechism of Trent points out that God commanded all men to be baptized. So, there's a problem.
Yeah.
It's infallible that God does not command impossibilities. And it's anathema to say that the commandments are impossible to observe.
Right.
And baptism is commanded, but baptism is impossible to observe. No, that's wrong. It's an error. Okay? And so that it's just simply wrong, and that it's not protected the same way the council is. The catechism is not protected, and basically, and see, here's a misconception that a lot of people have. They think that every theologian at a particular time, or every saint, or every even pope will have a perfect knowledge of the theological status of a truth. So if baptism of the desire is definitely contrary to the teaching of Trent, which it is, then everyone, at that time would have understood that. No, that's not the case. There were many popes, and that's what the geocentrism issue proves, another issue, that popes in their fallible capacities can be confused about the theological status. And so, for instance, St. Alphonsus, in trying to argue for baptism of desire, quotes that Innocent III letter. The one we were talking about, which is to a bishop, the Bishop of Metz, and he says that that's infallible, or he says that proves that it's de fide. Sorry, that doesn't. Then that would prove that Innocent III's teaching on circumcision was de fide too, which is clearly wrong. No, and here's another point: we have an advantage over all the saints of that period, because we live after the definition of papal infallibility.
Oh,
and
yeah, we do, don't we?
Yeah, and so we can
think about that.
And so the definition of papal infallibility tells us with more specificity which documents rise to the level of infallible statements.
I've never thought of that.
Whereas before the definition of papal infallibility, people really sort of they obviously understood that the Pope was the final judge, and they understood the concept of infallibility, but they would sort of lump that together with common opinions of theologians at the time, etc. And so it wasn't as precise. And so that's how errors arose.